In this chapter, we're going to develop models to explain the reproductive strategies of organisms, including sexual and asexual reproduction. Now, the first thing that we need to know about models in the NJSS is that they represent systems. So the practice and the cross-cutting concept are inextricably linked. But models are more than just representations. Of course, they have parts that represent the parts of the system, but they also need to represent how those parts interact, and they need to predict how the system behaves or explain how the system works. A lot of times we throw around the word model to talk about, say, the model of a cell, and we just want people to make that representation without these two other crucial steps. Now, models can come in different forms. In this lesson sequence, we're going to be looking at analogies, physical models, and pictorial models. And the reason there's so many different ways to represent things is because each one has advantages and disadvantages that help reinforce the underlying concept that we're trying to teach. One quick note about language with our physical models. Our curriculum talks about making a physical model of sexual reproduction. That's just ripe for challenges in a middle school classroom to use those exact words. So I recommend that you talk about making a physical model of how traits are determined in sexual reproduction. Before we get into physical models, we start the chapter focusing in on why we want to learn something new. In Lesson 1, the Green Ninja introduces the unit challenge. Then, students take a unit pre-assessment to share what they already know about the unit's concepts. And since the unit challenge is to protect a species from the effects of climate change, we want to build empathy for the situation that plants and animals are in. We make an analogy that the Earth is a home, and we ask students to consider, what does it feel like when someone disrupts your home? In Lesson 2, students revisit the Earth is like a home analogy from the previous lesson. Then they receive the unit pre-assessment back so they can work together to refine their answers so that everyone starts on the same page. The last activity is a call to action. We watch a Bill Nye video clip talking about how important it is to act, and then students make a simple mathematical model that shows how quickly one person's actions can spread and make a huge difference. Once students are inspired to take action, we view and discuss the Protecting Plants and Animals unit roadmap to show them our pathway to get there. Every lesson needs a mystery that gives purpose to our science learning, and it's now time for us to introduce that mystery. Now, diversity is something that we expect in all of our human populations. I mean, when we look at our friends, we can tell them apart, and that's good because we can distinguish our best friends from our archenemy. When it comes to the microscopic critters that make our bread dough, however, organisms look like identical twins, or maybe identical trillion tuplets. I'm afraid that you really don't get the sense of that from this picture because cells can be at different stages. Like if one identical twin just woke up and the other had just showered, they'd look a lot more different than their genetics would indicate. But this is a mystery that we're going to solve. In Lesson 3, students view the phenomenon image and wonder, how do organisms get to be so different? A brief presentation contains images that showing a broad range of how organisms reproduce. And then students become experts on two particular organisms, one that reproduces sexually and one that reproduces asexually. Students then group up with experts on other organisms to share out in a jigsaw and complete Part 2 of the worksheet. Use Part 3 to scaffold a whole class discussion. We'll continue Part 3 next time. In that next lesson, students finish generating a class list of the general characteristics of reproductive strategies of organisms. Then they focus on developing a model of asexual reproduction. We start with an analogy using a cake recipe. By doubling the ingredients and then splitting the batter, a person can create two identical cakes. And then the modeling reproduction handout guides students to develop a model of how asexual reproduction looks like that cake recipe. In Lesson 5, we again start with an analogy, this time a fruit bowl. We challenge students to create new bowls of fruit with different combinations following some specific requirements. Students will use that analogy and a physical model to answer the question, how are traits inherited in sexual reproduction? Part 2 of the modeling reproduction worksheet guides the process. And we end with an exit ticket where students fill in the gaps in a sentence using their understanding of different types of reproduction. In Lesson 6, students address the question, what are the similarities and differences between asexual and sexual reproduction? They create a Venn diagram and then use their understanding to revisit the reproductive strategies phenomenon that yeast in a population all look the same, but people don't. Towards the end of class, we transition to looking at animal behaviors. Students observe one phenomenon of animal behavior, sandhill cranes dancing, and wonder how could this help them? This is just one of the many behaviors in the Animal Behavior Part 1 presentation video that focuses on mate selection behaviors. We'll spend more time on animal behavior next chapter.